The law office smelled of old leather and disappointment. I'd been in Marcus Henley's office enough times over 43 years to know that particular combination. The musty scent of legal volumes mixed with the sharp tang of coffee that had been sitting too long on the warmer. Today, though, there was something else in the air. Something that made my chest tight and my hands want to fidget with the worn wedding ring I still wore on my left hand. Caroline would have hated this. I sat in the middle chair of three arranged in front of Marcus's mahogany desk. My son, Ethan, to my right, my daughter, Sarah, to my left. The symmetry felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if Marcus had arranged us this way on purpose. Between us sat the silence that had been growing thicker for the past 6 months, ever since Caroline's funeral, ever since we'd all realized that the woman who held our family together was never coming back. Marcus cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. At 72, he was 2 years older than me, but he carried himself with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that words, once spoken in legal settings, couldn't be taken back. His silver hair was combed straight back, and his blue suit was pressed to perfection. Caroline had always liked Marcus, trusted him with our important papers, our wills, the deed to the lake house. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus said, his voice carrying the formal weight that legal proceedings demanded. "We're here for the reading of Caroline Helen Dalton's last will and testament, dated April 15th, 2023. I closed my eyes briefly. April 15th, 2 weeks before her diagnosis. She'd insisted on updating everything after my heart attack the previous winter. Said she wanted to make sure our affairs were tidy, as she put it. At the time, I'd thought she was being overly cautious. Now I understood it was love. Pure, practical love. Richard," Marcus continued, looking directly at me, "Caroline has named you as the primary beneficiary for personal effects and the family residence. The lake house, however," my chest tightened. The lake house. Caroline's sanctuary. The place where she'd spent every summer morning with her coffee and her crossword puzzles, where she'd taught both children to fish off the old wooden dock, where she'd made me promise to scatter her ashes when the time came. The lake house and its contents are to be divided equally between Ethan Michael Dalton and Sarah Elizabeth Dalton Fisher, along with the investment accounts Caroline maintained separately. Marcus paused, looking over his glasses. The total value of these assets is approximately $430,000. Each child will receive equal shares. The words hung in the air like smoke. 430,000. I'd known Caroline was careful with money, but I hadn't realized she'd been that careful. She'd never made a big deal of it, never flaunted it. Just quietly built something solid for our children, the way she'd quietly built everything else in our lives. Sarah shifted in her chair beside me. I could feel her tension, the way she always carried stress in her shoulders. At 42, she still had Caroline's delicate features, her mother's way of pressing her lips together when she was thinking hard. She wore a simple black dress today, no jewelry except for her wedding ring, and a small pair of pearl earrings that had been Caroline's. "Equal shares," Ethan repeated, and something in his tone made me turn to look at him. At 45, Ethan had my height, but none of my bulk. Where I'd spent decades swinging hammers and lifting lumber, Ethan had spent his adult life behind desks, managing other people's money. His dark suit was expensive, his tie perfectly knotted, his brown hair was starting to thin at the temples, and he had the pale complexion of a man who spent more time under fluorescent lights than sunlight. "Yes," Marcus said simply. "Equal shares. The will is quite specific about this." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Marcus, I appreciate Mom's intentions, but I think we need to consider the practical aspects here." Something cold settled in my stomach. The way he said practical aspects reminded me of the tone he used when discussing his clients' portfolios, clinical and detached. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked quietly. Ethan turned to face her, and I saw something in his expression that I didn't like. It was the same look he'd had as a teenager when he was about to convince Sarah to take the blame for something he'd done. "Sarah, you and Tom are doing well, really well. The house in Denver, Tom's practice, the kids' college funds all set up. You don't really need this money." His voice was reasonable, measured. "I, on the other hand, have some opportunities coming up. Investment opportunities that could benefit the whole family." "Ethan," I said quietly, Your mother was very clear about her wishes. He glanced at me, then back at Sarah. Dad, you know Mom always wanted what was best for the family as a whole. She'd want us to be smart about this, not just divide things up arbitrarily. Marcus set down the will and folded his hands. The will is quite explicit, Ethan. There's no ambiguity in Caroline's instructions. But surely there's some flexibility, Ethan pressed. Sarah, what do you think? Wouldn't it make more sense for me to manage the lake house? You're in Colorado, you barely visit. And the investment accounts, I could roll them into a family trust, make them work harder for all of us. I watched Sarah's face as she processed what her brother was really asking. Her mother's daughter, she was too polite to call it what it was, a grab for money that wasn't his. Sarah started, then stopped. She looked at me, then at Marcus. I need to think about this. Of course you do, Ethan said quickly. I'm not asking for an answer today. I'm just saying we should consider all our options before we make any permanent decisions. The word permanent hit me wrong. Caroline's decisions had been permanent, final, made with the kind of careful thought she brought to everything from holiday dinners to major life choices. The idea that her son would want to reconsider her wishes 6 months after we'd laid her to rest made my hands clench into fists. I thought about the night Caroline had called Marcus to update the will. She'd been sitting at our kitchen table, the one I'd built from oak planks 30 years ago, wearing her reading glasses and making notes in her precise handwriting. Richard, she'd said, looking up from her legal pad, I want to make sure the children are taken care of equally, not according to who needs it more or who might use it better. Equally. Promise me you'll make sure of that. I'd promised. Sitting there in our kitchen, with the smell of her evening tea still hanging in the air, and her wedding ring catching the light from the pendant lamp above the table, I'd promised. Marcus, I said now, my voice steady but carrying an edge that made both my children look at me. Please continue reading the will, all of it. Marcus nodded and picked up the document again. There are a few additional provisions. Caroline has requested that her jewelry collection be divided between Sarah and any future daughters-in-law or granddaughters. Her books are to go to the local library with the exception of her cookbooks, which she's left to Sarah, and there's a personal letter for each of you. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew 3 sealed envelopes. Caroline's handwriting on each one, still clear and careful, even though her hands had been shaking by the time she'd written them. For Richard, for Ethan, for Sarah, I took mine and felt the weight of it, the slight thickness that suggested more than just a few lines. Caroline had always been thoughtful with her words, never wasting them, but never skimping when something important needed to be said. Ethan held his envelope but didn't open it. Before we get sentimental, he said, I think we should finish discussing the practical matters. Sarah, I really think you should consider what I'm suggesting. The lake house is expensive to maintain. The property taxes alone are $8,000 a year. The dock needs replacing. The roof will need work in the next few years. It's not just an asset, it's a responsibility. Sarah looked down at her unopened letter. Ethan, I understand what you're saying, but... Do you, though? Ethan interrupted, his voice taking on that patient tone he used when he thought someone wasn't understanding something obvious. You visit maybe once a year, twice if we're lucky. Tom doesn't even like it up there. The kids prefer the beach in California. Be honest. When's the last time you spent more than a weekend at the lake house? I watched my daughter's face crumple slightly. She'd always been sensitive about not visiting enough, always felt guilty about the distance between Colorado and Missouri, about the way her life had pulled her away from the place where she'd grown up. That's not the point, I said quietly. Ethan turned to me, and for a moment I saw something flash in his eyes. Annoyance, impatience. Dad, with all due respect, you don't understand the financial complexities here. I understand that your mother wanted her children to share equally in what she left behind. But if one child can't properly utilize their share, Ethan, the sharpness in my voice surprised all of us, including me. Your mother spent months thinking about this will. She consulted with Marcus. She considered every detail. She knew exactly what she was doing. People change their minds, Ethan said. Circumstances change. Mom made these decisions before we really understood the full scope of the maintenance issues, before we knew how little Sarah would actually use the property. No, I said, standing up. The leather chair creaked as I rose, and I felt the familiar ache in my lower back that had been with me since my construction days. Your mother knew exactly what she was doing, and I know what I'm doing now." The room went quiet. Marcus sat back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral. Sarah stared down at her hands. Ethan looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and frustration. "I'm not going to sit here and listen to you try to talk your sister out of her inheritance," I continued, my voice steady but carrying the weight of 43 years of marriage to a woman who'd taught me the difference between fairness and convenience. "Your mother left explicit instructions. We're going to follow them." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Dad, you're being emotional about this. I'm trying to think practically." "No," I said, reaching for my jacket. "You're trying to think selfishly. There's a difference." I walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Sarah was looking at me with something that might have been relief. Ethan was staring at his unopened letter like it might contain a different set of instructions. "Marcus, please prepare the paperwork according to Caroline's wishes. Exactly according to her wishes." I met Ethan's eyes. "And if anyone tries to pressure Sarah into giving up what her mother left her, they'll have to go through me first." I left them there in that leather-scented office, with their unopened letters and their uncomfortable silence. Outside, the October air was sharp and clean, carrying the smell of burning leaves from somewhere down the block. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing it in, trying to calm the anger that was building in my chest like steam in a kettle. 43 years of marriage, and I'd never broken a promise to Caroline. I wasn't about to start now. Comment fair if you want the truth to be revealed. The drive back to the lake house took 43 minutes, the same route Caroline and I had traveled together for the better part of 3 decades. Highway 54 to County Road J, then the winding gravel path that led through the pine trees to the only place that had ever felt like home to both of us. I kept the radio off, needing the silence to process what had just happened in Marcus's office. Ethan had revealed something today. Not just greed, I'd seen hints of that over the years, the way he'd calculated the value of gifts, the way he'd started talking about inheritance planning after my heart attack. No, today he'd shown me something worse. He'd shown me that he was willing to manipulate his sister's grief and guilt to get what he wanted. The lake house came into view as I rounded the final curve, and for a moment my chest loosened. 3 stories of cedar and stone, built into the hillside so it seemed to grow out of the earth itself. Caroline had fallen in love with it the first time we'd driven out here in 1987, when it was just a for sale sign and a developer's dream. We'd borrowed more than we should have, worked longer hours than we wanted to, but we'd made it ours. I parked in the circular gravel driveway and sat for a moment in the truck, looking up at the wraparound porch where Caroline had spent countless mornings with her coffee and her crossword puzzles. The hanging baskets were empty now, the flowers she'd planted last spring long since withered. I'd been meaning to clean them up, but somehow I couldn't bring myself to erase that last sign of her presence. Inside, the house felt too quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of evening settling in, but the hollow quiet of a place that was missing its central purpose. I hung my jacket on the hook by the front door. Caroline's jacket still hung there too, a blue windbreaker she'd worn for garden work, and walked through the living room to the kitchen. The kitchen was Caroline's domain. Not because I couldn't cook. 40 years of construction sites had taught me to make a decent meal out of almost anything, but because she'd loved it here. The wide windows looked out over the lake, and she'd spent hours standing at the sink, washing dishes by hand, even though we had a perfectly good dishwasher, just so she could watch the water and the wildlife. I opened the refrigerator out of habit, though I wasn't hungry. Inside, a carton of milk that was probably past its expiration date, some leftover casserole that one of the church ladies had brought after the funeral, a 6-pack of beer I'd bought weeks ago and hadn't touched. On the door, held by a magnet shaped like a cardinal, was a photo of Caroline and me from our 35th wedding anniversary. We were standing on the dock outside, her head on my shoulder, both of us squinting into the sun. I took the photo down and studied it. Caroline looked happy in that unself-conscious way she had when she thought no one was watching. Her gray hair was shorter then, and she was wearing the red blouse I'd bought her for Christmas that year. I remembered the moment the photo was taken. Sarah had suggested it, said we needed a picture of just you two for her photo album. Ethan had been there that day too, I remembered. He'd been the one who'd held the camera. The irony wasn't lost on me. I made coffee in the French press Caroline had preferred, measuring the grounds the way she'd taught me. While it steeped, I walked back to the living room and sat in my chair, the brown leather recliner that had molded itself to my shape over the years. From here, I could see Caroline's chair, a blue wingback that she'd reupholstered twice in the years we'd owned it. Her reading glasses were still on the side table next to it, along with the bookmark she'd been using in the last novel she'd started. The house phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. I almost didn't answer it. Few people called the landline anymore, but something made me pick up on the fourth ring. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was small, uncertain. "I just wanted to check on you. You left pretty abruptly." "I'm fine," I said, settling back into my chair. "Just needed some air." "Dad, about what Ethan said." She paused, and I could hear Tom's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "I don't know what to think. I mean, he's not wrong about us not using the lake house much, and the maintenance costs." "Sarah," I said gently, "do you remember when your mother first brought you out here? You were 8 years old, and you were convinced there were monsters in the lake." A soft laugh. "I remember. Mom sat with me on the dock for an hour, showing me how the water was so clear you could see the bottom. She said monsters couldn't hide in something so transparent. She also said this place would always belong to you and Ethan, no matter what. That it would be your sanctuary, the way it was hers." Silence stretched across the line. Then, "But what if Ethan's right? What if I can't take care of it properly?" I looked out the window at the lake, its surface mirror smooth in the late afternoon light. A pair of loons was gliding near the far shore, their calls echoing across the water. "Your mother didn't leave you this place because she thought you needed to take care of it," I said. "She left it to you because she wanted you to have it, because it was hers to give, and she chose to give it to both of her children equally." "I know, but—" "Sarah." I kept my voice gentle but firm. "Your brother is a good man in many ways, but he's also spent his entire adult life believing that financial efficiency is more important than emotional attachment. He sees this place as an asset to be managed. Your mother saw it as a legacy to be shared." Another long pause. "Dad, I don't want to fight with Ethan, especially not now." "I'm not asking you to fight with him. I'm asking you to think about what your mother would want, not what's convenient, not what's financially optimal, what she would want." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness, not bothering to turn on the lights. Outside, the automatic timer clicked on, illuminating the dock with warm yellow light. Caroline had installed that timer herself, said she liked the way it made the lake look in the evenings, like a stage set for something magical. I thought about the letter in my jacket pocket, still unopened. Caroline's final words to me. Part of me wasn't ready to read them, wasn't ready for that final goodbye, but another part of me needed to know what she'd wanted to say. I retrieved the envelope from my jacket and sat back down, holding it up to the light from the window. The paper was cream-colored, expensive. Caroline had always used good stationery for important things. Inside, I could see the shadow of her handwriting, dense paragraphs that suggested she'd had a lot to say. I opened it carefully, the way you open something precious. "My dearest Richard, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're sitting in that ugly brown chair of yours, probably drinking coffee that's too strong and wondering how you're going to manage without me. The answer is, one day at a time, just like we managed everything else. I know the children will have questions about the will, Ethan especially. He's always been our planner, our problem solver, and he's going to want to fix what he sees as inefficiencies in my decisions. Don't let him. I gave equal shares to both children because they are both my children, equally loved, equally deserving. Not because they'll use those shares equally, not because they need them equally, but because they are both part of me and part of you, and this place has been the best part of our life together. Sarah will doubt herself. She always has. She'll think she doesn't deserve her share because she doesn't visit enough, because Tom isn't as connected to this place as we are. Help her understand that this isn't about what she deserves. It's about what I wanted to give her. Ethan will argue. He'll use logic and financial projections and all those tools he's learned in his career. Help him understand that some things aren't meant to be optimized. Some things are meant to be honored. The lake house isn't just property, Richard. It's every summer morning I spent watching the sunrise from the kitchen window. It's every evening you and I sat on the porch, not needing to talk because being together was enough. It's every Christmas when the children were small and Sarah would wake up early to watch for deer in the yard. It's every 4th of July when Ethan would set off fireworks from the dock and pretend he wasn't afraid of the loud ones. Don't let them turn it into a transaction. Don't let efficiency win over memory. I love you, Richard Dalton. I loved you when you were a young carpenter with sawdust in your hair and dreams bigger than your bank account. I loved you when you worked 16-hour days to afford this place. I loved you through every challenge, every joy, every ordinary Tuesday that made up our life together. Take care of yourself. Take care of our children, even when they don't know they need taking care of. And remember, the best legacy isn't what we leave behind. It's how we protect what matters while we're still here to do it. All my love, Caroline P.S. There's a bottle of that good whiskey in the pantry, behind the coffee filters. It was meant for your birthday, but I think tonight might be a better time. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it on the side table next to my chair. My eyes burned, though whether from grief or anger, I couldn't tell. Caroline had known. She'd known exactly what would happen, had seen the fight coming as clearly as she'd seen everything else about our family. I found the whiskey where she'd said it would be, a bottle of 18-year-old Macallan that must have cost her more than she'd wanted to spend. The note attached to it was brief. For the nights when coffee isn't strong enough. C. I poured 2 fingers into one of the good glasses, the crystal ones we'd gotten as a wedding gift and hardly ever used. Then I carried it back to my chair and raised it toward Caroline's empty seat. To promises kept, I said aloud, and took a sip. The whiskey burned, but it was a good burn, the kind that warmed you from the inside out. I sat there as full darkness settled over the lake, watching the lights from the distant shore flicker like fallen stars. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called, its voice wild and lonely. I thought about Ethan as a boy, 8 years old and trying to bait his own hook for the first time. His small hands had fumbled with the worm, his face scrunched up in concentration. When he'd finally managed it, he'd looked up at me with such pride that I'd felt my chest swell with love for this serious little boy who worked so hard to master everything he attempted. That boy was still in there somewhere, underneath the expensive suits and the financial calculations. But he'd learned to bury his heart beneath his ambitions, and I wasn't sure he remembered how to dig it back up. Sarah called again around 9 o'clock, just as I was thinking about heading upstairs to bed. "Dad, I read Mom's letter," she said without preamble. "And she was pretty clear about what she wanted. Yes, she was. Ethan's not going to like it." I looked out at the lake, where the moon was beginning to cast a silver path across the water. "Your mother didn't write that will to make Ethan happy. She wrote it to make things fair. I know, it's just, Dad, he can be really persuasive when he wants something, and he's not wrong about the practical stuff. Tom and I really don't get out there much, and the kids are so busy with their own activities." "Sarah," I said, interrupting her before she could talk herself out of what was rightfully hers, "let me ask you something. If your mother were sitting here right now, what would she tell you to do?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Sarah's voice came back, stronger than before. "She'd tell me to stop making excuses for Ethan. She'd tell me that just because something is practical doesn't make it right. And she'd be correct. Dad?" "Yes? Tomorrow, when Ethan calls, and he will call, I'm going to tell him I've made up my mind. I'm keeping Mom's share." After we hung up, I finished my whiskey and locked up the house. In the master bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed Caroline and I had shared for almost 30 years. Her pillow still smelled faintly of her shampoo, the lavender scent she'd used for as long as I could remember. I thought about tomorrow, about the phone calls and the arguments and the family dinner that would probably never happen now. I thought about the careful way Ethan would present his case, using numbers and projections to prove that love could be quantified and optimized. But mostly I thought about Caroline's words, "Don't let efficiency win over memory." Outside, the lake lapped quietly against the shore, the same sound that had lulled us to sleep for decades. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own decisions. But tonight, in this house that Caroline had made ours, I felt the weight of her trust settling over me like a blanket. I had made her a promise, and I intended to keep it, even if it cost me a son. The phone started ringing at 7:30 the next morning, before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. I let it go to the machine, listening to Ethan's voice echo through the kitchen as I stood at the window, watching a great blue heron pick its way through the shallows near the dock. "Dad, it's me. We need to talk about yesterday. I think there were some misunderstandings, and I'd like to clear the air. Call me back when you get this." His tone was carefully modulated, reasonable, conciliatory, the voice he probably used with difficult clients. I deleted the message and poured myself a second cup of coffee. The heron struck suddenly, its neck extending like a spear into the water. When it lifted its head, a silver fish writhed in its beak. Efficient, practical. Exactly what Ethan would call good resource management. The phone rang again at 8:15. This time I answered. "Good morning, Ethan." "Dad, thank God." I was starting to worry. He paused and I could hear traffic in the background. He was probably driving to work, fitting our family crisis into his commute. "Listen, I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. I'm not trying to cheat Sarah out of anything. I'm trying to help the family make smart decisions." I carried the phone to Caroline's chair and sat down, my fingers tracing the worn fabric on the armrest. "What kind of decisions?" "Well, for starters, we need to think about the tax implications. If Sarah takes her full share and then never uses the property, she's going to get hit with capital gains down the road. But if we consolidate everything under family management, we can minimize the tax burden for everyone." "Ethan, your mother paid an attorney good money to structure this will properly. I'm sure she considered the tax implications." "Dad, no offense, but Mom wasn't a financial planner. She was thinking with her heart, not her head. There's nothing wrong with that. But now, we need to be practical." I closed my eyes, remembering Caroline's letter. He'll use logic and financial projections and all those tools he's learned in his career. "Your mother," I said carefully, "was one of the smartest women I ever knew. She taught school for 30 years, managed our household budget, and raised 2 children. I think she was capable of making informed decisions about her own property." "Of course she was. I'm not saying she wasn't smart. I'm saying the world has changed. Estate planning is more complex now than it was when she wrote that will." The heron had moved on, leaving only ripples to mark where it had been. I watched them spread outward in perfect concentric circles until they reached the shore. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A family meeting. Tonight, if possible. You, me, Sarah, and Madison. We'll lay everything out on the table, look at all the options, make a decision that works for everyone." Madison, his wife. I should have seen that coming. Madison was 41, the same age Caroline had been when we had bought the lake house. But where Caroline had been warm and intuitive, Madison was cool and calculating. She worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company, spoke fluent corporate speak, and had never quite managed to hide her belief that small-town Missouri was beneath her. "I'm not sure that's necessary," I said. "Dad, come on, we're family. We should be able to work this out together." His voice took on a note of frustration. "Look, I'll be honest with you. Madison and I have been looking at some investment opportunities, real estate development specifically. We've got a chance to get in on the ground floor of something really big. But we need capital." There it was, the truth, finally stripped of its reasonable packaging. How much capital? $400,000 would cover our buy-in. Exactly the amount Caroline had left to be split between the children. I had to admire the precision of it. "And Sarah's share?" "Sarah doesn't need the money right now. Tom's practice is doing well. The kids are young. They've got time to build wealth through other means. But this opportunity won't wait. If we don't move in the next 60 days, we're out." I thought about Sarah's voice last night. The way she'd sounded when she'd finally decided to stand up for herself. The strength that had come into her tone when she'd quoted her mother. "Ethan, I think you should discuss this with your sister directly. I tried calling her this morning. She's not answering." Smart girl. Maybe she needs time to think. "Dad, time is exactly what we don't have. Look, I know you think I'm being selfish here, but I'm thinking about the long term. This investment could set up the whole family for generations. Sarah's kids, my kids, everyone benefits. What if the investment doesn't work out?" Silence stretched across the line. Then, "It will work out. I've done my research." I'd heard those words before, 15 years ago, when Ethan had convinced me to invest in his friend's restaurant. The restaurant had closed within 18 months, taking my $20,000 with it. Ethan had apologized profusely, promised to pay me back, then gradually stopped mentioning it altogether. I'll think about it, I said. That's all I'm asking? Just think about it. And Dad, maybe don't mention the investment opportunity to Sarah just yet. I'd like to present the whole package to everyone at once. After we hung up, I sat in Caroline's chair for a long time, looking out at the lake. The water was perfectly still now, reflecting the morning sky like polished glass. It was the kind of day Caroline would have spent in her garden, deadheading the roses and talking to her flowers in the gentle voice she reserved for living things that couldn't talk back. I walked out to the garden and found it exactly as she'd left it in September, just before the first frost. The roses were dormant now, their canes pruned back to stubby fingers. The perennial bed was covered with a thick layer of mulch. Even in death, Caroline's careful planning was evident. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to see a silver BMW pulling up to the house, Madison behind the wheel. Through the passenger window, I could see Ethan checking his phone. They climbed out of the car with the coordinated efficiency of a team that had rehearsed their approach. Madison wore a charcoal gray coat that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothes in the past year. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she carried herself with the kind of professional confidence that made me feel underdressed in my flannel shirt and work boots. "Richard," she said, offering me a practiced smile as they approached. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by. Ethan thought it might be better to discuss this in person." "Madison?" I nodded toward the house. "Come on in. I'll put some coffee on." Inside, they arranged themselves on Caroline's blue sofa like they were preparing for a business presentation. Madison set a leather portfolio on the coffee table and withdrew a manila folder. Ethan sat forward, his elbows on his knees, the same posture he'd used as a boy when he was about to ask for something he wasn't sure he'd get. "Dad," he began, "I want to show you something." Madison opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. Charts, graphs, architectural renderings of what looked like a resort complex. "This is the Branson Lakes Development Project," Madison said, her voice taking on the smooth cadence of a sales pitch. "Luxury vacation rentals, a championship golf course, spa facilities. The developers are looking for private investors to fund the initial phase." I picked up one of the renderings. It showed a sprawling complex of buildings nestled against a lake that looked suspiciously like the one outside my window. "The projected return on investment is 35% annually for the first 5 years, Ethan said. "After that, investors become partners in the ongoing operation. It's essentially a guaranteed income stream." "If it's such a sure thing," I said, setting down the rendering, "why do they need private investors? Why not go through a bank?" Madison and Ethan exchanged a glance. "They want investors who understand the vision," Madison said carefully. "People who appreciate the value of this kind of development." I studied the charts more carefully. The numbers were impressive, but something about them felt too neat, too perfect. In 40 years of construction, I'd learned to be suspicious of projects that looked good on paper, but didn't account for the messiness of reality. "Where exactly is this development supposed to be built?" "Lake of the Ozarks," Ethan said quickly. "Prime real estate. They've already secured the permits." I looked at the rendering again. The lake in the drawing had the same distinctive curved shoreline as the Lake of the Ozarks, but there was something familiar about the topography surrounding it. "This looks like Peacock Bay," I said slowly. Madison's smile faltered slightly. "You know the area?" "I built a vacation home there in 1994. Beautiful spot, but the soil conditions are tricky. Lots of underground springs, unstable clay substrate. Any development there would require extensive foundation work." I could see Ethan's jaw tighten. "The geological surveys have all been completed." "Who did the surveys?" I'd have to check on that." I set the documents back on the table and leaned back in my chair. "Ethan, how much of your own money are you putting into this project?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, if this is such a sure thing, why aren't you mortgaging your house to invest in it? Why aren't you liquidating your retirement accounts?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Madison fidgeted with her wedding ring, turning it around and around on her finger. "We've already committed our liquid assets," Ethan said finally, "but the minimum buy-in is $400,000. We're just short of that threshold. By exactly the amount your mother left to you and Sarah. Dad, that's coincidental." I stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the lake. Behind me, I could hear Madison whispering something to Ethan, but I couldn't make out the words. You know, I said without turning around, your mother and I looked at a lot of investment opportunities over the years. Resort developments, vacation rentals, timeshare properties. You know what we learned? What's that? Madison asked. The ones that needed private investors usually needed them because no legitimate bank would touch them. When I turned around, Ethan was staring at me with something that might have been disappointment or might have been anger. Dad, this isn't some fly-by-night operation. These are serious developers with a proven track record. Then they shouldn't have any trouble waiting until you can raise the money through conventional means. Madison closed the folder with a sharp snap. Richard, I think you're being unnecessarily cautious. Sometimes opportunities require a leap of faith. And sometimes, I said, meeting her eyes, they require more faith than common sense. They left shortly after that, their coordinated efficiency replaced by barely contained frustration. From the window, I watched them sit in the BMW for several minutes, Madison gesturing emphatically, while Ethan stared straight ahead. That evening, Sarah called just as I was heating up leftover soup for dinner. Dad, Ethan, and Madison came by the hotel. She was in Denver on business, staying downtown. They had a whole presentation ready, charts and graphs and architectural drawings. The Branson Lakes development, you've seen it? They brought it by this morning. What did you tell them? I told them I needed to think about it. But Dad, they were really persistent. Madison kept talking about family obligations and how Mom would want us to help each other achieve our dreams. I stirred the soup slowly, watching the vegetables swirl in the broth. What do you think your mother would say about this investment opportunity? Sarah was quiet for a moment. She'd say it sounds too good to be true. And she'd probably point out that if Ethan really believed in it, he'd find a way to finance it himself instead of trying to use Mom's money. Smart woman, your mother. Dad? There's something else? Madison mentioned that they've already put down a deposit, $5,000. She said they can't get it back unless they complete the investment within 60 days. I stopped stirring. They use their own money for the deposit? That's what she said. And she made it sound like if I don't agree to the plan, they'll lose everything they've already put in. I thought about the pressure tactics I'd seen on construction sites over the years. The artificial deadlines, the non-refundable deposits, the appeals to loyalty and family obligation. It was manipulation, dressed up in corporate language and family concern. Sarah, I said, your mother didn't leave you that inheritance so you could bail Ethan out of bad financial decisions. I know, but what if this really is a good opportunity? What if I'm being selfish? Then Ethan can present his business plan to a bank and get a legitimate loan. If the project is as solid as he claims, any commercial lender would be happy to finance it. That night, I called Marcus and left a message asking him to research the Branson Lakes development project. Then I sat in Caroline's chair, reading her letter again by the light of the lamp she'd positioned specifically for evening reading. Don't let them turn it into a transaction. Don't let efficiency win over memory. Outside, a loon called across the dark water, its voice wild and free. Caroline had loved that sound, said it reminded her that some things couldn't be tamed or optimized or turned into profit margins. I was beginning to understand that this fight wasn't really about money or lake houses or investment opportunities. It was about something much more fundamental, whether Caroline's final wishes would be honored or dismissed in favor of what someone else thought was more practical. I had made her a promise, and I was beginning to realize just how much it was going to cost to keep it. 3 weeks passed without a word from Ethan. The silence felt deliberate, calculated, the kind of treatment he'd used as a teenager when he wanted me to know I'd disappointed him. But this wasn't about a missed baseball game or a denied request for the car keys. This was about $400,000 and a family legacy that he'd decided to treat like a business transaction. I fell into a routine during those weeks. Morning coffee while watching the lake, afternoons working on small projects around the house, fixing a loose board on the dock, caulking around the bathroom windows, organizing Caroline's tools in the garage. She'd been meticulous about her gardening supplies, each implement cleaned and stored in its designated place. I found myself arranging and rearranging them, as if keeping her system intact could somehow keep her spirit present. The evenings were the hardest. That's when the phone used to ring with calls from the children, when Caroline would update me on Sarah's work project or Ethan's latest promotion. Now the phone sat silent, and I found myself talking to Caroline's empty chair, telling her about my day as if she might suddenly respond with one of her gentle observations about human nature. "Ethan thinks he can outlast me," I told her one Tuesday evening, raising my coffee mug toward her chair. "He's testing to see if I'll cave under the pressure of his disapproval." Outside, November rain drummed against the windows with the kind of persistence that made the house feel even more isolated. I'd always loved storms at the lake, the way they turned the water into hammered pewter and made the house feel like a ship riding out rough seas. But tonight the rain felt accusatory, as if even the weather was conspiring to make me second-guess my decision. Marcus called on a Thursday afternoon while I was replacing weather stripping around the front door. "Richard, I've got that information you requested about the Branson Lakes development." I set down my screwdriver and wiped my hands on a rag. "What did you find?" "Nothing good. The company behind it, Ozark Premier Developments, has been operating for less than 2 years. Their previous projects include a failed shopping center in Springfield and a restaurant that closed before it ever opened." My stomach tightened. "What about the permits they claim to have?" "Pending. Still pending. They've submitted applications, but the County Planning Commission hasn't approved anything yet. The environmental impact study alone could take another year." I sank into Caroline's chair, suddenly feeling every one of my 70 years. "Marcus, if someone invested in this project, what are the chances they'd see their money again?" Based on the company's track record, I'd say somewhere between slim and none. After we hung up, I sat staring out at the lake for a long time. A part of me wanted to call Ethan immediately to warn him that he was about to throw good money after bad. But another part, the part that had been listening to his lectures about financial efficiency and practical decision-making, wanted to see if he'd done his own due diligence before risking his family's inheritance. That evening, Sarah called from Denver. Her voice sounded tired, strained. "Dad, I need to tell you something. Ethan came to the office today." "To your office?" "He flew out this morning. Didn't call ahead, just showed up. My secretary said there was a family emergency, so I saw him immediately." She paused. "Dad, he's really angry. Not just frustrated, angry. He said you've been poisoning me against him." I felt heat rise in my chest. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that wasn't true, that I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions. But Dad, he's not giving up. He wants to meet with both of us next week. He says if we don't resolve this as a family, he's going to have to explore other options." "What kind of other options?" "He wouldn't say, but he mentioned something about challenging the will, questioning Mom's mental state when she wrote it. The words hit me like a physical blow. Questioning Caroline's mental state, suggesting that the woman who'd taught school for 30 years, who'd balanced our checkbook to the penny for 4 decades, who'd managed her own medical care through 18 months of cancer treatment, suggesting that she hadn't been competent to make decisions about her own property. "He can't do that," I said, but even as I spoke, I knew I was wrong. Of course he could do it. Anyone could challenge a will if they had enough money for lawyers and enough willingness to drag their family through the mud. "Dad, I'm scared. Not of losing the money. I never asked for it in the first place. I'm scared of what this is doing to our family. Mom wouldn't want us fighting like this." "Your mother," I said carefully, "would want her wishes respected. She spent months thinking about that will, Sarah. She consulted with Marcus. She considered every detail. She knew exactly what she was doing. I know, but maybe we should just give Ethan what he wants. Maybe it's not worth destroying our relationship over money." I closed my eyes, remembering Caroline's words. Sarah will doubt herself. She always has. Help her understand that this isn't about what she deserves. It's about what I wanted to give her. "Sarah, this isn't about money. This is about whether your mother's final wishes matter enough to defend them. But if Ethan really believes this investment will help the whole family, then he can get a bank loan." My voice came out sharper than I'd intended. "Sarah, I had Marcus research this Branson Lakes development. It's a scam. The company behind it has failed at every previous project. They don't even have the permits they claim to have." Silence stretched across the line. Then, quietly, "Did you tell Ethan?" "Not yet." "Are you going to?" I looked out at the dark lake, where a few lights from distant houses flickered like fallen stars. "I'm thinking about it." The next morning brought the first hard frost of the season. I woke to find the world transformed, every blade of grass and fallen leaf outlined in crystalline white. Caroline had loved mornings like this, would stand at the kitchen window with her coffee and marvel at the way winter could turn the familiar landscape into something magical. I was drinking my second cup of coffee when I heard gravel crunching in the driveway. Through the window, I saw a red pickup truck that I didn't recognize. A moment later, a man climbed out, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing jeans and a fleece jacket. It took me a moment to place him. Tom Fisher, Sarah's husband. I met him at the front door, surprised by the grim expression on his normally easygoing face. Tom was a good man, a veterinarian who genuinely cared about animals and people in equal measure. He'd married Sarah 12 years ago, and I'd never heard him raise his voice or lose his temper. But today he looked like a man who'd reached the end of his patience. "Richard," he said, offering his hand. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by. I was driving through on my way back from a conference in St. Louis." "Of course not. Come in. Coffee? Please." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Caroline had written her will, where she'd made countless decisions about our family's future. Tom cupped his hands around his mug as if drawing warmth from it, though the house wasn't particularly cold. "Richard, I need to talk to you about Ethan." "I'm listening." "He's been calling Sarah every day, sometimes twice a day. He's got Madison calling too, and her parents. They're all working on Sarah, trying to convince her that she's being selfish, that she's betraying the family by not supporting this investment." My jaw tightened. "And how is Sarah handling it?" "She's losing sleep. She's questioning herself, wondering if maybe Ethan is right. Maybe she should just give him what he wants so the family can go back to normal." Tom leaned forward, his voice intense. "Richard, my wife is one of the strongest women I know. She runs a department of 30 people, makes decisions that affect millions of dollars in research funding. But when it comes to her family, she turns into that 8-year-old girl who just wants everyone to be happy." I thought about Sarah at 8, the way she'd always tried to make peace between Ethan and me when we disagreed about his chores or his grades. She'd been our little diplomat, smoothing over conflicts with her gentle interventions. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to stop this before it gets worse. Sarah told me about Ethan's threat to challenge the will. Richard, if he does that, it'll destroy what's left of this family. And for what? Some development project that sounds too good to be true?" I told him what Marcus had discovered about Ozark Premier developments. Tom listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. "So, Ethan is trying to pressure Sarah into investing in a company that's basically a scam operation. It looks that way. Does he know about the company's track record?" "I don't know. Maybe he's done his research and doesn't care. Maybe he's so committed to this investment that he's willing to overlook the red flags. Or maybe he's just desperate enough to take any opportunity that comes along." Tom stood and walked to the window that looked out over the lake. The frost was beginning to melt in the morning sun, turning the world wet and bright. "Richard, can I tell you something in confidence?" "Of course." "Sarah and I have been talking about divorce." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Tom, not because we don't love each other. We do. But this whole situation with the inheritance, it's bringing out things in Sarah that I've never seen before. This self-doubt, this willingness to sacrifice what's rightfully hers just to avoid conflict. It's making me wonder if I really know my wife at all." He turned away from the window to face me. "And it's making me realize that as long as Ethan can manipulate her this way, she'll never be free to make her own decisions. There will always be another crisis, another family obligation, another reason why Sarah needs to put everyone else's needs before her own." I felt something cold settle in my chest. The idea that Caroline's death might lead to the destruction of Sarah's marriage was almost too much to bear. "Tom, what can I do?" "Fight for her, even if she won't fight for herself. Make it clear to Ethan that his manipulation isn't going to work, that there are consequences for treating family like business assets." After Tom left, I called Marcus and asked him to schedule a meeting for the following week. It was time to make some changes to my own will to ensure that if something happened to me, Sarah's inheritance would be protected from any future pressure from her brother. But more than that, it was time to send Ethan a message that his current strategy wasn't going to work, that there were people in his family who still remembered the difference between love and leverage. That evening, I called Sarah at home in Denver. "How are you holding up?" I asked. "I'm okay, Dad. Tom told me he came to see you. I hope you don't mind." I don't mind. He's a good man, Sarah. He loves you. I know. I wish this whole thing would go away. I wish Mom had never left us anything if it was going to cause this much trouble. Your mother left you that inheritance because she loved you, because she wanted you to have something that was hers, something that connected you to this place and to her. Don't let Ethan's greed make you regret her love. Dad, what if he really does challenge the will? What if this goes to court? I looked out at the lake, where the evening light was turning the water to liquid gold. Caroline had loved this time of day, the hour when the world seemed suspended between day and night, between what was and what might be. Then we'll fight it, I said, and we'll win. Because your mother was completely competent when she wrote that will, and because Marcus documented everything properly. But more than that, we'll win because what we're fighting for is right. I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of the good whiskey Caroline had left for me and sat in her chair, watching the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressure from Ethan and Madison. But tonight, I felt the weight of Caroline's trust settling over me like armor. I had promised to protect her legacy, and that's exactly what I intended to do. My son tried to claim his sister's share. I couldn't stay silent at the inheritance reading. Part 5, The Plan. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, delivered by certified mail that required my signature. I knew what it was before I opened it. The return address bore the name of a Kansas City law firm I'd never heard of. Inside, legal letterhead framed 3 pages of carefully worded threats, wrapped in the polite language of professional courtesy. Dear Mr. Dalton, we represent Mr. Ethan Michael Dalton in matters concerning the estate of Caroline Helen Dalton. Our client has concerns regarding the circumstances surrounding the execution of the will dated April 15th, 2023, and the influence that may have been exerted upon the deceased during her final months. I read it twice, my coffee growing cold in my hand. The language was careful, clinical, but the message was clear. Ethan was challenging his mother's will on the grounds that she'd been mentally incompetent when she'd written it, and that I had somehow manipulated her into making decisions that weren't in her best interests. The irony was breathtaking. Ethan, who hadn't visited his mother more than a handful of times during her illness, was now claiming that I, her husband of 43 years, had somehow brainwashed her into being fair to both her children. I called Marcus immediately. I've been expecting this, he said when I read him the letter. Richard, you need to understand something. This isn't about winning in court. Ethan's lawyers know they don't have a case. Caroline was absolutely competent when she wrote that will, and I documented everything thoroughly. This is about pressure. They're hoping the threat of a long, expensive legal battle will convince you and Sarah to settle. What kind of settlement? Probably something close to what Ethan originally wanted. Maybe they'll offer Sarah a token amount. $50,000, $100,000, and keep the rest. I walked to the window and looked out at the lake, where ice was beginning to form along the edges. In a few weeks, the entire surface would be frozen solid, and the world would be locked in winter's grip until spring returned. Marcus, what are our chances if this goes to court? Excellent, but it'll take time, and it'll be expensive. And, Richard, he paused, it'll be ugly. They'll try to paint you as a controlling husband who manipulated a sick woman. They'll dig into every aspect of your marriage, every financial decision you made together. They'll try to make Caroline look like a victim instead of the strong, independent woman she was. After we hung up, I sat in Caroline's chair for a long time, thinking about the choice ahead of me. I could fight, spend the next year or two in depositions and court hearings, watching lawyers dissect my marriage and my wife's final months. Or I could try to find another way. That afternoon, I drove into town and stopped at Henderson's Hardware, the store where I'd bought supplies for countless projects over the years. Jim Henderson was behind the counter, same as always, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he tallied receipts. Richard, he said, looking up with genuine warmth, how are you holding up? Getting by. Jim, I need to ask you something. You know anything about home security systems? His eyebrows rose slightly. Thinking about installing something at the lake house? Maybe. What would you recommend? We spent the next 20 minutes discussing cameras, motion sensors, and remote monitoring systems. Jim pulled out catalogs and showed me setups that ranged from basic door alarms to sophisticated networks that could be controlled from a smartphone. This one here, he said, pointing to a mid-range system, would give you cameras on all the entry points, plus motion detection in the main rooms. Everything gets recorded to a cloud server, so even if someone breaks in and steals the equipment, you'd still have the footage. How hard is it to install? For someone with your background, shouldn't be too difficult. Most of it's wireless now. Just mount the cameras and sync them to the base station. I bought the system that afternoon, along with new deadbolts for all the exterior doors. If Ethan was going to challenge the will, I wanted to make sure the house was secure. But more than that, I was beginning to formulate a plan that went beyond just defending Caroline's wishes in court. That evening, I called my accountant, Paul Richardson, who'd been handling my taxes for 15 years. Paul, I need to talk to you about estate planning, specifically about setting up a trust. What kind of trust? The kind that would protect certain assets from legal challenges. We talked for 40 minutes about revocable trusts, irrevocable trusts, and charitable foundations. Paul explained how moving assets into trust could shield them from creditors and legal claims, how it could ensure that my wishes would be carried out regardless of what happened to my will. The thing is, Richard, once you put assets into an irrevocable trust, you can't get them back. You're essentially giving up ownership, even if you retain some control over how the assets are used. What if I wanted to ensure that the lake house would always remain available to Sarah and her children? A family trust could handle that. You could set it up so that Sarah has lifetime use of the property, with it passing to her children after her death. Even if someone challenged your will, they couldn't touch assets that are properly held in trust. How long would it take to set something like that up? A few weeks if we move quickly, but, Richard, this kind of trust planning usually requires significant assets to justify the legal costs. I thought about the lake house, worth at least $300,000 according to the latest tax assessment. And there were my retirement accounts, the proceeds from selling my construction business, the life insurance policy that would pay out $200,000 to my estate. I think I have enough to justify it. The next morning, I started installing the security system. The cameras were smaller than I'd expected, each one about the size of a smoke detector. I mounted them at strategic points, one overlooking the driveway, one covering the front door, two more watching the back of the house and the dock. The motion sensors went inside, hidden behind furniture and in corners where they wouldn't be noticed unless someone was looking for them. The whole system connected to a base station in my bedroom closet, which in turn linked to my phone through an app that Jim had shown me how to use. I could monitor the cameras from anywhere, receive alerts when motion was detected, even review recorded footage from the past 30 days. It felt strange, turning my own home into a fortress. But if Ethan was willing to challenge his mother's will based on false claims about her mental state, I wanted to be prepared for whatever else he might try. Sarah called that evening, her voice tight with stress. "Dad, I got a copy of the letter from Ethan's lawyers. How can they say those things about Mom? Anyone who knew her would know she was completely sharp right up until the end. That's exactly what we're going to prove in court. But Dad, what if we're wrong? What if there's something they know that we don't? What if Mom really wasn't thinking clearly when she wrote the will?" I could hear the doubt in her voice, the way Ethan's constant pressure was making her question her own memories. "Sarah, do you remember the last conversation you had with your mother?" "Of course. It was 3 days before she died. She was tired, but she was completely herself. She asked about the kids, about Tom's practice. She made me promise to keep her recipes, said she didn't want them to be lost. Does that sound like someone who wasn't thinking clearly? No. But Dad, I'm scared. What if this goes to court and they twist everything around? What if they make it sound like Mom was confused or that you somehow forced her to write the will the way she did? Then we'll present the truth. We'll have Marcus testify about her mental state when she signed the will. We'll have medical records showing that she was competent. And Sarah, we'll have you testify about what kind of woman your mother was. What if I'm not strong enough? What if I cave under pressure?" I thought about Tom's visit, about his fears that this fight was changing Sarah in ways that might damage her marriage. "Sarah, I want you to consider something. What if there was a way to protect your inheritance that didn't require going to court?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if I could set things up so that even if Ethan wins his challenge, your mother's wishes would still be honored?" I explained about the trust, about how moving the lake house and other assets out of my direct ownership could shield them from legal challenges. Sarah listened without interrupting, and I could almost hear her thinking through the implications. Dad, that sounds complicated and expensive. It would be both, but it would also be permanent. Once the trust is established, Ethan couldn't touch it, no matter what happens with the will challenge. What about you? Would you still be able to live at the lake house? I'd retain lifetime use rights. Nothing would change for me day to day. But legally, the property would be held in trust for you and your children. Silence stretched across the line. Then, Dad, why are you willing to do this? You could just let Ethan have what he wants. Keep the peace in the family. I looked out at the lake, where the security cameras now kept their silent watch. In the distance, a light flickered in one of the houses across the water. Someone else's family settling in for the evening, probably oblivious to the drama playing out in their neighbors' lives. Because 43 years ago, I made a promise to your mother. I promised to love her, to honor her, and to protect what mattered to her. She's gone now, but the promise isn't. Dad? Yes, I love you, and I'm proud to be your daughter. After we hung up, I poured myself a small glass of whiskey and sat in Caroline's chair, watching the lake in the darkness. The motion sensors had activated the exterior lights when a deer had wandered through the yard earlier, and now everything was peaceful again. Tomorrow, I would start the process of establishing the trust. I would move the lake house and a significant portion of my other assets beyond Ethan's reach, ensuring that Caroline's legacy would be protected regardless of what happened in court. But tonight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Not hope that this fight would end easily, but hope that it would end correctly. That when the dust settled, Caroline's wishes would be honored and Sarah would have what her mother had wanted her to have. Outside, a loon called across the dark water, its voice wild and free. Caroline had always said that loons were symbols of persistence, birds that could disappear beneath the surface for long periods, but always came back up, stronger and more determined than before. I raised my glass toward the darkness where that voice had come from, and toward the memory of the woman who taught me that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Part 6. The Confrontation. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a gray December afternoon, in the conference room at Marcus's law office. I arrived 15 minutes early and found Marcus arranging documents on the mahogany table with the careful precision of a man preparing for battle. "How are you feeling about this?" he asked, not looking up from his papers. Like a man about to have a conversation he's been avoiding for 45 years. Marcus smiled grimly. "That's probably accurate. Richard, remember what we discussed. Let me handle the legal arguments. You focus on the family aspects, what Caroline wanted, what she believed in. Don't let them draw you into a fight about money or business opportunities." Through the conference room window, I could see the parking lot where Ethan's BMW sat next to Madison's white Mercedes. They'd arrived together, probably strategizing during the drive from Kansas City. I wondered if they'd brought their lawyer with them, if this was going to be a formal legal proceeding or just a family meeting with attorneys present. At exactly 2 o'clock, Ethan and Madison entered the conference room, followed by a man I didn't recognize. He was younger than Marcus, maybe 50, with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that telegraphed success. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes had the calculating look of someone who made his living from other people's conflicts. "Richard," Ethan said, offering his hand. His grip was firm, professional, the handshake of someone trying to establish dominance through physical contact. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." "Ethan." I didn't return the enthusiasm in his greeting. "Madison." She nodded coolly, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look older and harder than her 41 years. She wore a black suit that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothes in the past 5 years, and carried herself with the kind of rigid confidence that came from believing money could solve any problem. "This is our attorney, David Caldwell," Ethan said, gesturing toward the silver-haired man. "David, my father, Richard Dalton." Caldwell's handshake was even more aggressive than Ethan's, and his smile had the predatory quality of a man who enjoyed conflict. "Mr. Dalton," he said smoothly, "I hope we can resolve this matter quickly and amicably. Family disputes are always unfortunate, but they don't have to be destructive." "That depends on what you're trying to destroy," I said, taking my seat across from them. Marcus remained standing, his hands resting on the back of his chair. "Before we begin, I want to make it clear that this meeting is being recorded, and that anything said here could potentially be used in legal proceedings. Caldwell waved a dismissive hand. Of course, we have nothing to hide. Good, Marcus said, activating a small digital recorder and placing it in the center of the table. Then let's begin. Ethan leaned forward, his expression earnest. Dad, I want you to know that this isn't personal. I'm not trying to hurt you or dishonor Mom's memory. I'm trying to do what's best for the family. By challenging your mother's will, by ensuring that her assets are managed responsibly. Dad, be honest. Do you really think Mom understood the full implications of her decisions? The tax consequences, the maintenance costs, the complex financial planning required to manage multiple properties? I felt heat rise in my chest. Your mother taught high school mathematics for 30 years. She balanced our household budget for 4 decades. She managed her own medical care through 18 months of cancer treatment. I think she was capable of understanding the implications of leaving equal shares to her children. Madison spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the practiced modulation of someone accustomed to corporate presentations. Richard, we're not questioning Caroline's intelligence. We're questioning whether she had access to all the relevant information when she made these decisions. What kind of information? Caldwell opened a manila folder and withdrew several documents. Information about the current real estate market, about optimal investment strategies for inherited assets, about the tax advantages of consolidated family wealth management. He spread the papers across the table like a poker player, revealing a winning hand. Charts showing property values, graphs depicting investment returns, financial projections that stretched 20 years into the future. What Caroline didn't know, Ethan said, is that splitting the inheritance the way she did actually hurts both Sarah and me. Sarah gets saddled with property she can't afford to maintain and doesn't want to use. I get forced into a passive investment position instead of being able to actively manage the family's wealth. I studied the documents without touching them. The numbers were impressive, professionally presented, designed to make Caroline's straightforward approach look naive and outdated. Where do these projections come from? My firm, Madison said. We've run comprehensive analyses of similar family situations. The data clearly shows that consolidated management produces better outcomes for all parties involved. Marcus leaned forward. May I see the methodology behind these analyses? Caldwell's smile flickered. The specific methodology is proprietary, but I can assure you that it's based on industry standard practices. Industry standard practices for what industry? Marcus pressed. Estate planning, investment management, real estate development? General wealth management, Ethan said quickly. The point is, Dad, Mom made her decisions based on emotional considerations rather than financial realities. And you think that was wrong? I think it was incomplete. She was thinking about fairness in the short term, not about what would actually benefit her children in the long term. I looked at my son across the conference table, this man I'd raised from birth, whose first steps I'd witnessed, whose tears I'd dried countless times during his childhood. He was speaking about his mother with the clinical detachment of a financial advisor discussing a client's portfolio. Ethan, what do you think your mother's primary concern was when she wrote that will? She wanted to provide for her children. That's right. She wanted to provide for both her children, equally, not based on who she thought would manage the money better, or who had more immediate need, or who could present the most convincing business plan, equally. Madison shifted in her chair. But Richard, equal treatment doesn't always produce equal outcomes. Sometimes true fairness requires unequal distribution. According to whom? According to basic principles of wealth management, Caldwell interjected. Mrs. Dalton's approach, while well-intentioned, essentially guarantees that both children will receive less value than they could under optimal management. Marcus spoke without looking up from his notes. Mr. Caldwell, are you suggesting that the deceased was not competent to make decisions about her own property? I'm suggesting that she may not have had access to all the relevant information. Information that was somehow hidden from her during the months she spent consulting with me about her will. Information about investment opportunities that weren't available at the time she wrote the will. I felt something click into place. You're talking about the Branson Lakes development. Ethan's jaw tightened. Among other opportunities, yes. The development project that requires a $400,000 minimum investment. Dad, This is exactly what I mean about not having all the relevant information. That project represents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for our family. I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew the folder Marcus had prepared for me. Inside were copies of the documents he had obtained about Ozark Premier developments, including incorporation records, previous project histories, and permit applications. Ethan, have you researched this company? Of course I have. Then you know that Ozark Premier Developments has failed at every previous project they've attempted. Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. Caldwell's smile disappeared entirely. Madison stared down at her hands. Ethan's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, then something that might have been anger. What are you talking about? I spread Marcus's documents across the table, covering Caldwell's financial projections. Ozark Premier Developments has been in business for less than 2 years. Their previous projects include a shopping center in Springfield that went bankrupt before construction was completed, and a restaurant in Branson that closed 6 months after opening. They don't even have the permits they claim to have for the lake development. Ethan picked up one of the documents, his face pale. Where did you get this? From public records. The same public records you should have checked before risking your family's inheritance on a company with a track record of failure. Madison's composure finally cracked. You had us investigated? I had the investment opportunity investigated. The same thing any responsible person would do before committing $400,000 to a development project. Caldwell gathered his papers with quick, efficient movements. Mr. Dalton, I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot here. Perhaps we should table the discussion of specific investment opportunities and focus on the broader issues. The broader issues, Marcus said calmly, are that my client's wife wrote a legal, valid will that clearly expressed her wishes, and that will is going to be probated exactly as written. Unless, Caldwell said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, the court determines that Mrs. Dalton was not competent when she executed the will, or that she was subjected to undue influence. The threat hung in the air like smoke. I looked at Ethan, waiting for him to distance himself from his lawyer's words, to show some recognition that we were talking about his mother's memory and reputation. Instead, he stared down at the Ozark Premier documents, his jaw working silently. Ethan, I said quietly, is that really what you want to do? Drag your mother's name through court, claim that she wasn't smart enough to make her own decisions, argue that I somehow manipulated her into being fair to both her children? He looked up, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of the boy he'd once been. Uncertainty. Maybe even shame. Then Madison touched his arm, and the moment passed. Dad, we're trying to work with you here, but if you force us into litigation, we'll use every tool available to protect our interests. Your interests, I repeated. Not the family's interests, not your mother's interests. Your interests. I stood up, suddenly feeling tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. Marcus, I think we're done here. Richard, wait. Ethan half rose from his chair. We don't have to end things this way. There's still time to work something out. You're right, I said, turning back to face him. There is still time. Time for you to accept your mother's wishes with grace. Time for you to treat your sister with the respect she deserves. Time for you to remember that family is about more than financial optimization. I walked toward the door, then stopped. But Ethan, if you choose to challenge your mother's will, if you choose to question her competence and drag our family through the courts, then you should know something. What's that? You won't win, not in court, and not in any way that matters. Outside Marcus's office, the December air was sharp and clean, cutting through the stale atmosphere of legal maneuvering and family betrayal. I sat in my truck for a few minutes, hands on the steering wheel, breathing deeply and trying to process what had just happened. My son had chosen money over memory, calculation over compassion. He was willing to destroy his mother's reputation and his family's peace for the sake of a fraudulent investment opportunity that he hadn't even bothered to research properly. But he'd also revealed something else. He was desperate. The aggressive legal posturing, the expensive lawyer, the elaborate financial presentations, all of it screamed of someone who needed this money more than he was willing to admit. I started the truck and drove toward the lake house, where the security cameras I'd installed would be watching over Caroline's sanctuary. Tomorrow, I would finalize the trust documents that would protect her legacy regardless of what happened in court. But tonight, I would sit in her chair and tell her about the choice our son had made, and about the choice I was making in response. Some promises I had learned could only be kept by fighting for them. The trust documents were signed on a Friday morning in mid-December, in Marcus's office with Paul Richardson serving as witness. The process had taken 3 weeks of careful legal work, but when I set down the pen after the final signature, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Caroline's funeral. Peace. "It's done," Marcus said, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "As of today, the Richard and Caroline Dalton Family Trust owns the lake house, along with $200,000 in assets designated for Sarah's benefit. You retain lifetime use rights, but legally, Ethan can't touch any of it." I looked out Marcus's window at the gray December sky, where snow was beginning to fall in fat, lazy flakes. What happens to Ethan's legal challenge now? Technically, he can still proceed with it, but he'll be fighting over your personal assets, not the trust property. And since the trust is irrevocable, even if he somehow won in court, he couldn't force you to undo it. Paul adjusted his glasses and reviewed the final pages one more time. "Richard, you understand that you've essentially given up ownership of your most valuable assets. The tax implications alone." "I understand," I said, "and I'm comfortable with the decision." What I didn't say was that the decision felt like the most natural thing in the world. Caroline had always been the true heart of our home. Now the legal structure finally reflected that reality. The lake house would belong to Sarah and her children, just as Caroline had wanted. And if Ethan chose to continue his legal challenge, he'd be fighting for scraps while the real prize remained safely beyond his reach. The drive home took longer than usual because of the snow, but I didn't mind. The weather gave me an excuse to drive slowly, to think about the conversation I'd need to have with Sarah. She was flying in from Denver that evening for what might be our last Christmas together, as any kind of intact family. The lake house looked different in the falling snow, more like the sanctuary Caroline had envisioned when we'd first bought it. The security cameras were barely visible under their caps of white, and the motion sensor lights cast warm pools of yellow across the driveway. Inside, I'd already put up Caroline's Christmas decorations. Not all of them, but enough to make the house feel festive rather than abandoned. Sarah's rental car pulled into the driveway just after 6 o'clock. I watched from the kitchen window as she climbed out, pulling her coat tight against the cold. At 42, she still moved with the careful grace she'd inherited from her mother. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way stress had settled into her posture over the past few months. "Dad," she said when I opened the door, wrapping me in a hug that felt like forgiveness. "The house looks beautiful. Your mother always said Christmas wasn't about the decorations, but the decorations helped." We sat in the living room with cups of hot chocolate, the same recipe Caroline had used when the children were small. Sarah curled up in her mother's chair, her stocking feet tucked under her, looking younger than she had in years. "Tom told me about the trust," she said quietly. "Dad, I can't believe you did that for me. I didn't do it for you. I did it for your mother. But you gave up ownership of everything, the house, your retirement accounts. I gave up legal ownership. Nothing else changes. I still live here. I still pay the taxes and maintenance. But now it's protected from people who think they can manipulate family grief for financial gain." Sarah stared into her hot chocolate. "Ethan called yesterday. He's furious about the trust. He says you've declared war on the family. What do you think?" "I think you've protected what Mom wanted to protect. And I think Ethan is finally realizing that his pressure tactics aren't going to work." We spent the evening decorating Caroline's tree, the 7-foot Fraser fir that I'd driven 2 hours to buy from the same farm we'd patronized for 20 years. Each ornament carried its own memory. The handprint angels Sarah and Ethan had made in elementary school. The ceramic nativity scene Caroline had collected piece by piece over the years. The silver bell that played Silent Night when you touched it. "Remember when Ethan broke the angel?" Sarah asked, holding up a slightly lopsided ornament with a crack running through one wing. "Your mother spent an hour gluing it back together, said broken things could still be beautiful if you cared enough to fix them." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Do you think Ethan can be fixed?" I considered the question while hanging Caroline's favorite ornament, a glass snowflake that caught the tree lights and threw tiny rainbows across the wall. I think Ethan is going to have to decide what kind of man he wants to be, and I think that decision might be harder than he realizes. The next morning brought a phone call that I'd been expecting. Ethan's voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath. "Dad, we need to talk about this trust situation." "What about it?" "You can't just give away family assets without consulting the family." "I didn't give them away. I protected them." "From what?" "From people who think your mother's final wishes are negotiable." Silence stretched across the line. When Ethan spoke again, his voice had taken on the patronizing tone I'd learned to recognize over the past few months. "Dad, I understand you're trying to honor Mom's memory, but this trust move, it's not rational. You've essentially impoverished yourself to spite me. I've ensured that your mother's legacy will be preserved regardless of what happens in court." "What happens in court?" Ethan's laugh was bitter. "Dad, there's not going to be a court case. My lawyer says challenging the will isn't worth the cost now that you've moved the major assets into trust." I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "So, you're dropping the legal challenge? We're reassessing our options." It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough. Ethan was backing down, probably because Caldwell had explained that fighting over my personal effects and remaining bank accounts wouldn't generate enough money to cover his legal fees. "Ethan, there's something I want you to understand. This was never about the money. It was about respecting your mother's wishes. I know you think that, but Dad, you've essentially chosen Sarah over me. You've given her everything and left me with nothing." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. I walked to the window and looked out at the lake, where the morning sun was turning the snow to diamonds. "I've given Sarah what your mother wanted her to have. Your inheritance is still waiting for you in the will exactly as Caroline wrote it. The only difference is that now it can't be manipulated or stolen." "Stolen? That's what you were trying to do, Ethan. Steal your sister's inheritance by pressuring her into giving it up, then lose it all on a fraudulent investment scheme you hadn't even bothered to research." "Dad, no, let me finish. For months, you've treated this family like a business deal. You've manipulated your sister's grief, questioned your mother's competence, and hired lawyers to challenge the woman who gave you life. And for what? A development project run by people who've failed at everything they've ever attempted." The silence that followed was so long, I wondered if he'd hung up. "Dad," he said finally, his voice smaller than before, "I never meant for it to go this far. But it did go this far, and now you have to decide what comes next." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you have to decide whether you want to be part of this family or continue treating it like a hostile takeover." After we hung up, I sat in Caroline's chair and read her letter again, the one she'd left me with the will. Her words felt prophetic now. Don't let them turn it into a transaction. Don't let efficiency win over memory. That afternoon, I called Tom in Denver. "Richard, Sarah told me about the trust. That was a hell of a thing to do. It was the right thing to do. How's Sarah handling everything?" I looked toward the kitchen, where Sarah was making her mother's sugar cookies, following the recipe card written in Caroline's careful handwriting. "She's finding her strength. Your wife is tougher than she gives herself credit for." "I know, but this whole situation with Ethan, it's changed her. Made her realize she doesn't have to apologize for taking up space in her own family." Tom was quiet for a moment. "Richard, I owe you an apology. When I came to see you last month, I was angry about what this fight was doing to my marriage. I blamed you for not just giving Ethan what he wanted. And now? Now I realize you were protecting my wife from her own generous nature. If you'd let Ethan pressure her into giving up the inheritance, she'd have spent the rest of her life wondering if she'd betrayed her mother's memory." That evening, Sarah and I sat on the couch watching the snow fall outside the big picture window. The tree lights cast a warm glow across the room, and the house felt peaceful in a way it hadn't since Caroline's death. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think Mom knew? About Ethan, I mean, about what he might try to do?" I thought about Caroline's letter, about her precise predictions of how each child would react to the will. Your mother was one of the most perceptive people I've ever known. She saw things in people that they didn't even see in themselves. Then why didn't she structure the will differently? Why didn't she anticipate this fight? Because she believed that doing the right thing was more important than avoiding conflict. She could have given Ethan everything and avoided this whole mess, but it wouldn't have been fair to you. She could have left everything to charity, but she wanted her children to benefit from what she and I had built together. Sarah curled deeper into the couch cushions. She was braver than I am. No, sweetheart. She just had 43 years to practice standing up for what she believed in. You're learning to do the same thing. On Christmas morning, Sarah and I exchanged simple gifts in front of Caroline's tree. I gave her a photo album I'd made of all the pictures Caroline had taken at the lake house over the years. Family gatherings, quiet moments, seasonal changes captured through the kitchen window. Sarah gave me a leather-bound journal with my initials embossed on the cover. For your stories, she said, Tom thinks you should write down some of the things you've learned about family and building and life. He says our kids should know where they came from. As we cleaned up the wrapping paper, the phone rang. Sarah tensed, probably expecting another call from Ethan. Instead, it was Tom, calling to wish us both a Merry Christmas and to talk to his wife. I gave them privacy and walked out to the dock, where the snow had turned the familiar landscape into something magical. The lake was beginning to freeze along the edges, and the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. I thought about Caroline, about the woman who'd chosen this place as our sanctuary and had fought to preserve it for her children. I thought about Sarah, who was learning to claim her space in the world without apology. And I thought about Ethan, who was somewhere in Kansas City spending Christmas morning with Madison's family, probably still trying to figure out how his careful plans had unraveled so completely. The fight wasn't over, might never be completely over. Ethan would have to live with the choices he'd made, and our family would have to find a way forward that acknowledged the cracks that had appeared in its foundation. But standing there in the snow, surrounded by the peace Caroline had built and the legacy she'd protected, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not for reconciliation necessarily, but for continuation. The lake house would remain Sarah's sanctuary, as Caroline had intended. And maybe someday Sarah's children would stand on this same dock and understand that they were part of something larger than themselves. A family that had learned the difference between love and manipulation, between inheritance and entitlement. Behind me, I could hear Sarah laughing at something Tom had said, her voice carrying clearly through the still air. It was the sound of someone who'd found her strength, who'd learned to protect what mattered without apologizing for taking up space. Caroline would have been proud. That evening, as Sarah packed for her flight back to Denver, she paused in the living room doorway. Dad, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about Ethan having to decide what kind of man he wants to be. And I think I've had to make the same decision about what kind of woman I want to be, what kind of daughter, what kind of sister. What did you decide? She smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like Caroline, the same gentle strength, the same quiet determination. I decided I want to be the kind of woman who honors her mother's memory by standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs me a relationship with my brother. After she left, I sat in Caroline's chair with a glass of wine and the journal Sarah had given me. I opened it to the first page and wrote, Christmas Day, 2023. Today I kept a promise I made 43 years ago. The cost was higher than I expected, but some promises are worth whatever they cost to keep. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in pristine white. In the spring, it would melt and reveal the landscape underneath, changed but enduring. And in the years to come, Sarah's children would play in this same snow, swim in this same lake, and learn from their mother the lessons Caroline had taught me. That family is about more than blood, that love sometimes requires difficult choices, and that the best legacy isn't what you leave behind, but how you protect what matters while you're still here to do it. The fight was over. The promise was kept. And for the first time since Caroline's death, the lake house felt like home again. If you like this ending, type like.